If you enjoy the contents of the 80 Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and would like to sponsor the channel, then see the link in the description below for the Patreon page, and start enjoying the benefits of being a patron of the 80 Slasher Librarian. And enjoy tonight's narration of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand.
But remember, the risk of cheating the plan, of disrespecting the design, could incite a fury that could terrorize even the Grim Reaper. And you don't even want to fuck with that, Mac Daddy. I'll see you soon.
Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand, Chapter 4. Just another beautiful day in Las Vegas, muttered Warren Ackerman. He might have actually meant it if he hadn't been standing in the middle of a crime scene, staring at a bloodstain the size of Rhode Island. Death is a part of life. Warren must have heard that old cliché spoken 100 times, if not more, during his time in the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. It usually came up as part of the eulogies at funerals, but just because he'd heard it so often didn't mean it had lost its impact. Not 20 years ago, when he was a rookie cop, and not now as a homicide detective. It was meant to bring some peace of mind to the families of the victims, a way of assuring them that their loved one's passing was just a part of some great cosmic balance. Dust we were, and to dust we shall return. To Warren, however, it only meant that they'd been cheated of their chance to live a full life. That especially held true when the victim was 10 years old. Danny Lariva was just like any other kid. According to the neighbors, he played with the others in the playground behind the housing complex, liked watching cartoons, never made any trouble. A happy little boy who told people he wanted to be a wrestler when he grew up, like his heroes on the TV. A little boy now lying bruised and bloody and very dead on the living room floor of his mother's apartment. Another life lost, Warren thought, and for what? What kind of goddamn cosmic balance depended on the death of an innocent child? He felt the anger building and fought to push it back down. He closed his eyes and ground his teeth, knowing he needed to focus, needed to emotionally distance himself from what he was seeing, or he'd be no good on this investigation. No good to himself, and no good to the victim. Slowly the barrier slid down around his heart, the one that protected him from the shock, the anger, the misery of what he faced. The mental shield that allowed him to feel nothing until the job was done, until the killer was brought to justice and his victim could rest easier. Warren had spent years building that barrier, like every cop did. It was the only way to work a case with any level of efficiency. When the murderer was caught, when the case had been cleared, that would be the time for the barrier to lift. That would be the time for mourning. Warren opened his eyes and looked around. The apartment wasn't all that large. A combination living room kitchen, 2 moderately sized bedrooms and a small bathroom. And it had quickly filled up with crime scene technicians gathering evidence. Still, despite the shabby, low-rent quality of the building in which it was located, The apartment was modestly decorated and surprisingly clean. It had a woman's touch, with lace curtains on the windows and plastic slipcovers on the couch and chairs. And a devoutly religious woman, at that, if the statue of the Virgin Mary on the TV, the crucifix hanging above the front door, and the large votive candle on the kitchen table were any indication, she probably went to church a lot as well. Warren glanced down at the lifeless body on the floor and grimaced. All that devotion to God, and he still looked the other way while her boy was beaten to death. Would she still be able to believe the Almighty had decided to call him back to heaven, when the evidence of his brutal end was soaking into those lace curtains and spattered across those plastic slipcovers? Maybe she would. Maybe she'd need to in order to make some sense out of such a senseless act. Maybe her devotion to God was all she had left now. There were little framed pictures scattered around the living room tables. Photos of a little boy growing up, and his proud mother. No sign of any father, though. They were only memories of a child who would never get any bigger, nor any older. Snapshots of a life ended far too soon. Danny had been a cute kid, just as the neighbors had told Warren during the preliminary interviews, but there was little remaining of that childhood beauty. His bare arms and chest were a mass of bruises and welts, his face broken and bloodied and barely recognizable. The dark, bowl-cut hair was matted with thick clots of blood, and the left eye socket had been crushed. The impact crater of a large ring was gouged deep into the purpled skin. It had taken a lot of strength to do all this. A lot of strength and a lot of anger. "Jesus Christ," a woman muttered softly. Warren turned toward the door. Isabel Montoya had become his partner only 6 months ago. For some reason, she'd actually requested a transfer to homicide from Vice. He figured it was probably because she got tired of dressing up like a hooker for sting operations. At least corpses weren't going to be interested in fucking her the moment she walked into a crime scene. As yet, she hadn't gotten around to telling him her reasons for leaving, and he hadn't felt the need to press the issue. He did know her superiors had been annoyed at losing her. Her sultry looks and keen street instincts were a hard combination to find in the department. But the brass had okayed the transfer anyway, and no one had argued the point. Could have been because of her impressive service record. Could have been because she had juice with some big shot in the department, as Warren had heard rumored. Problem was, she was almost too pretty to be working homicide. With that shoulder-length black hair and those high cheekbones and long legs, she could have passed for one of Shauna's showgirl friends. Too bad she hated amusement park rides. Her husband Charlie did too. Still, despite the department jokes about Beauty and the Beast partnering up, he and Isabel had become a pretty good team, both on and off duty, and had come to enjoy each other's company. He and Shauna had even double-dated a few times with Izzy and Charlie, although setting those up always turned into logistical nightmares with their conflicting work schedules. Shauna was in Magapalooza 6 days a week, Charlie worked nights as an electrician for Nevada Power, and Warren and Izzy had cases to clear. And yet, through trial and error, they somehow came up with ways to make arrangements, if only to give the Montoyas a much-needed break from their 3 rambunctious kids. Izzy had even joked on an occasion or two that working homicide was a welcome distraction from the unwelcome arrival of puberty in her house, especially with a daughter who looked like she was going to become the spitting image of her mother. But now that she'd gotten a good look at the latest victim, it was clear from Isabel's horrified expression that she was beginning to wonder if requesting that transfer from Vice had been a smart move after all. Warren stepped forward to block her view. "What do you got, Izzy?" he asked. It took her a moment to focus, but then she shook her head and looked up at him. She jerked a thumb over her shoulder in the direction of the neighbors who'd come to gawk at the crime circus that had set up its tent for the day. A better show you couldn't find off the strip, Warren thought darkly. "Couple of the neighbors said they heard yelling about 10 a.m. Couldn't make out what was said, but there always seemed to be some yelling going on in here." She glanced at the notepad she held to check over what she'd been jotting down. "I checked with dispatch. 6 calls in the past 4 months. Warren frowned. "Domestic disturbance, right?" Isabel nodded. "Last one was a week ago Friday." "And today?" "Nothing." She shrugged. Guess everybody just got used to the noise, huh? Warren grunted. Until it stopped. Where's the mother? Isabel nodded back with her head. A few doors down with a neighbor. Ferguson says she's a wreck. She leaned to the side to glance around her partner, then crossed herself. Can't say I blame her. Warren drew a deep breath, then exhaled sharply. Let's go see her. Carolina Lariva was still wearing her housekeeper's uniform, a light blue short-sleeved dress and matching flat-heeled shoes. An embroidered patch over the left breast identified her as an employee of Merlin's Tower. She was heavy-set, in her 40s, wisp of gray sprinkled through her short dark hairstyle. There were traces of varicose veins in her left leg, no doubt from long hours spent on her feet. Warren's father, Jay, had suffered from the same condition whenever he was a cop. She was hunched over in one corner of a blue plaid futon, rocking back and forth. The apartment's owner, an African-American woman named Carly Rumbelow, sat beside her, one arm draped over the mother's shoulders. Warren noticed that Carolina clutched a set of wooden rosary beads as she softly moaned a prayer, asking God to take care of her son, more than likely. According to Terry Ferguson, the first uniform on the scene, Mrs. Lariva had been the one who discovered her son's body. It was her screams that prompted one of the neighbors to call for help, eventually. She was long past screaming now, the initial horror replaced by shock and disbelief. She was replaying the scene over and over in her mind. Her numbed expression was all Warren needed to see to confirm that suspicion. He also knew she'd been seeing it for a long time to come. Warren nodded slightly to Ferguson as he squeezed into the small apartment and walked up to the grieving mother. "Mrs. Lariva," he said. Her only response was to keep rocking, sobbing all the while into the balled-up wad of Kleenex she clenched tightly in her hands. The tissues were already soaked through. "Mrs. Lariva," he repeated a bit louder. When she finally looked up, he pointed to his badge, clipped to the breast pocket of his jacket. "Detective Ackerman. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am." She nodded. "Thank you," she replied hoarsely. Warren gestured toward Isabel, who'd come in just behind him. "This is my partner, Detective Montoya. We'd like to ask you a few questions, if you're up to it." She nodded again. "Okay." Warren looked over to Mrs. Rumbelow, who moved off the couch to make room for him and Isabel. They took their seats, and Warren reached into his jacket's inner pocket to pull out a notepad and pen. He paused before speaking, giving Mrs. Lariva time to pull herself together. They'd have to go slow and careful in questioning her, try to avoid upsetting her. Bad enough her boy was dead. Grilling her on the particulars of the circumstances leading up to it might push her over the edge. Carolina dabbed at her eyes with the shredded tissues, then took a deep breath. Her entire body quivered as she slowly released the air through her nostrils. "All right," she said quietly, and turned to face him. "I understand there were a number of domestic disturbance calls over the past few weeks," Warren began. "Could you tell me what those were about?" Carolina glanced away, her lips drawing tightly shut. They were nothing." The sounds of flipping pages brought him back to Isabel. She was going over her notes. "On 15 March at 10:36 p.m., officers Bradstreet and Niles arrived at your apartment in response to a call about a woman being beaten. They found you on the floor with a split lip and black eye. They questioned the male Latino in the residence at the time. He said you'd had an accident. You refused to press charges?" "Because it was nothing," Carolina insisted. "Nothing." "On April 22nd at 2:17 a.m., officers Ortega and Ang responded to another call. This time you required transport to Valley Hospital Medical Center." She glanced up to stare at Carolina. 2 cracked ribs and a broken nose?" "I guess that was nothing too, right?" Warren raised a quizzical eyebrow. "And who was involved in these nothing calls? Your husband?" She moved her head, more like a quick snap than a shake. "Don't have no husband. He ran off just after Danny was born. I never seen him again." "The reports list of Robert Diaz," Isabel said. "Is he a friend? A boyfriend?" "Boyfriend," Carolina replied. She paused. "He lose his temper sometime, when he drink too much." She looked Isabel straight in the eye. "But that don't mean he don't love me." "I'm sure," Izzy said blandly, although Warren picked up on the sarcastic tone in her voice right away. He cut her a quick glance, watch it now, then turned back to Mrs. Lariva. "What about Danny?" he asked. "He and Roberto get along?" Carolina shook her head. "Danny, he never like Roberto, never respect him. Always talking back. All the time saying how he not Danny's father. So he don't know, he don't have to listen to him." "And how did Roberto take that?" She looked away. "Danny's words, they hurt him a lot." A little hard to believe, but Warren wasn't about to press the issue. "Hurt him how?" She frowned. "It not right, a boy so young talking like that to a grown man." "Did they hurt Roberto enough to make him angry?" Warren asked. She halted in mid-speech, then looked back to him, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What do you mean?" "You said Roberto loses his temper when he drinks," Warren replied. "Was he ever drinking when Danny said these things to him?" "Roberto is good man," Carolina snapped. "He worked very hard, try to make a good life for us. You think he hate my boy, hate him enough to kill him?" "I didn't say he hated your son, Mrs. Lariva," Warren said. "I was just asking if—" "He can't help it if sometime Danny do something stupid," she continued. "Sometimes he needs how you say, the discipline." She nodded as though agreeing with herself. "Roberto only try to help him be a better boy, to set him straight." It was as though a switch had been tripped in Warren's brain. The barrier around his heart lowered just a bit, and he felt his lips draw back in a snarl. "Be a better person?" he asked slowly. "He was a 10-year-old kid, for Christ's sake." Carolina drew away from him and crossed herself, as though to ward off his curse. Before he could utter a few more choice words, Izzy gently placed a hand on his arm, and he wisely fell silent, saving him from himself. "How often did Roberto have to, discipline Danny, Mrs. Lariva?" she asked. Carolina sighed. "He was always getting into trouble, that boy. Very clumsy, you know. Always running around the apartment, jumping on the chairs, and so loud, too." She shook her head. "Like the people on the TV." "The, wrestlers?" Isabel asked. "I understand Danny was a big fan of wrestling." Carolina smiled wistfully and dabbed at her eyes. "He wanted to be a luchador when he grew up, but that was never going to happen." "What makes you say that?" "He was never no good at paying attention," Carolina explained. "Like at school, his teachers all the time telling me he wouldn't sit still for nothing. They couldn't teach him nothing." Another forlorn headshake. "How you going to learn to be a luchador someday when you won't try to learn what they teach at school first?" "Danny had a learning disability?" Isabel asked. Carolina shrugged. "I don't know. The doctors say something was wrong with him, but maybe it'll go away in time. Me and Roberto, we don't make a lot of money, so we can't afford no fancy doctors." "You mean specialists?" Carolina nodded. "All I can do is pray to God to make my Danny better." Like that did a hell of a lot of good, Warren thought. "And when the prayers didn't work out," he asked, "that's when Roberto would have to discipline him?" "Sometimes," Carolina replied. "It was for his own good." "Yeah, to make him a better person?" Warren said, feeling the barrier slide again. "I got that." Izzy's hand tightened around his wrist, but he ignored her. So much for trying not to upset the victim's mother. "And do you think Roberto might have been disciplining Danny this morning, Mrs. Lariva?" She started to reply, then clamped her mouth shut and turned away. She rolled the balled-up Kleenex around in her hands. strips of the sodden tissues drifting to the carpeted floor as the rosary beads tore through them. Was she wrestling with her conscience? Trying to come to grips with the very real possibility that her boyfriend had beaten her son to death because he'd been clumsy once too often? Or was she just stalling for time? Warren was beginning to think he needed to take a firmer approach to the questioning when Carolina finally responded. "Maybe," she whispered. It took another 10 minutes to prod the information they needed from her. Where Roberto Diaz lived, where he worked, where he might have gone after leaving the apartment. For a woman who just lost her only child, Carolina was surprisingly resistant in helping them track down a suspect in the boy's murder. It made Warren wonder if a part of Mrs. Lariva wasn't relieved that she didn't have to deal with such a disrespectful, uncontrollable kid anymore. That maybe with Danny gone, she and Roberto could finally have a life together without the unwanted complications. Was it possible? Could any mother put a relationship with an abusive boyfriend, with any man, for that matter, above the well-being of her child? Christ, yes. The news was always covering stories of mothers who'd drowned their kids in the bathtub, mothers who'd suffocated their kids while they slept, mothers who'd slipped their kids rat poison in their oatmeal. The kind of horrid little tales that outraged TV viewers and spiked ratings for weeks, until people eventually lost interest. Then it was on to the next shocking lead story and the next round of outrage. But whether the perpetrators did it because God told them to, or because the man with whom they were involved had mentioned in passing how the kids were cramping his style, one thing was clear. Given the right circumstances, the fairer sex could be every bit as cruel, every bit as disturbingly heartless, as any man mothering instinct be damned. Did Carolina Lariva fall into that category? It was hard to tell at this point. On the one hand, it was clear that Danny's death had come as a great shock to her. You couldn't fake the grieving she was going through. But on the other, given her reluctance in providing information on Roberto, well, you just had to wonder what she was thinking. Or maybe, Warren considered, he'd been on the job too many years and had grown as cynical as his old man had become during his years on the force. "There are two kinds of people in this world," Pops had told him one day. "Perps and victims." There were no gray areas in law enforcement. Only blacks and whites, good guys and bad. A harsh way of looking at things, but then 15 years as a murder cop tended to darken one's point of view, as Warren had learned firsthand. That didn't mean, however, that he had to be a complete cynic. So, until he learned something different, he would give Mrs. Lariva the benefit of the doubt. For now, he'd trust Danny meant more to her than hanging on to a boyfriend who'd apparently pulled a quick fade sometime between the time Carolina had left for work and the time she'd returned home to find her son dead. Warren would have a better idea of just how trustworthy she was after he'd convinced a deputy district attorney to put a tap on her phone. There was always the chance Carolina might try to contact Roberto and let him know the heat was on. Warren's mouth twisted in a rough smile. He might not be a complete cynic, but he wasn't a complete idiot either. He left the apartment just behind Isabel. She slipped on the pair of sunglasses she kept in her jacket breast pocket. The morning glare was getting a little too bright. "So, where do you want to start?" she asked. "We'll finish canvassing," he replied. "See if one of the neighbors saw somebody other than Roberto leaving the apartment before the mother got here." She tilted her head down and gazed at him from above the rim of her shades. "But you doubt it, right?" He did, but settled for a non-committal shrug instead of voicing his thoughts. "We're supposed to be impartial, remember? Innocent until proven guilty. For all we know, Bobby stepped out for a pack of cigarettes and left the door unlocked. No signs of forced entry from what I saw. And when he got back, he saw the body, freaked out and split. If that's the case, then all we got to do is talk to him and find out if he knows what might have happened." "And if he is the one who killed Danny?" Warren sneered. "Then we nail that fucker to the goddamned wall." A small flare of light reflecting off metal caught his eyes, and he looked ahead to see the team from the medical examiner's office carting away a body bag on a stretcher. Danny Lariva's next stop was a coroner's table. to determine his cause of death. That shouldn't take too long, Warren thought, considering the evidence was plainly tattooed all over the kid's body. "Poor little guy," Isabel commented. She sighed. "You know what they say. Death is a—" "Don't," Warren said sharply. He glanced from his partner to the body bag as it rolled away. "Just don't." From the corner of his eye he caught sight of Izzy glaring at him. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's just, I just never cared much for that old saying. Seems too shallow, especially when there's a kid involved. Know what I mean?" Izzy nodded. "Yeah, you're right. It was just the first thing that popped into my mind." "Mm-hmm." Warren looked at the growing crowd of spectators. "Better start asking around before the crowd gets bored. You start on the right, I'll take the left. We'll meet in the middle. Get Ferguson and some of the others to help out. I don't want anybody wandering off. We haven't talked to them. They stay." "Got it." Izzy looked up at the bright blue sky and shook her head. "Some morning, huh?" she said with more than a hint of sarcasm. She headed off to begin her interviews. Warren grunted and fished around in his jacket for his own pair of sunglasses. "Yeah," he muttered. "The start of just another beautiful day in Las Vegas." Chapter 5. "So, what do you want to do now?" Tom asked. Allie shrugged. "I don't know." She flashed a smile. "See how much a divorce costs?" He started to reply, but she held up her hands to stop him. "Kidding, just kidding." Tom eyed her suspiciously. "Mm-hmm." An uneasy silence filled the space between them. She on the bed, he across the room in a chair by the balcony doors. They'd showered and dressed separately, then ordered room service and had breakfast. They'd eaten in silence, focusing their attention more on watching the Today Show than on having to look one another in the eye across the table. But once the food was gone and Katie and Matt had signed off for the day, there was nothing left for the newlyweds to do but take stock of their situation. That was when each had gone to their respective corners. The next 15 minutes had been spent staring at each other, at the walls and ceiling, at the view of the Vegas Strip outside their hotel room. It was followed by a fair amount of throat-clearing and embarrassed smiling. A few instances of tugging at their clothes to pick off imaginary pieces of lint, a lot of sighing, but not a great deal of meaningful discussion, just like now. "You did want to talk about this, right?" Tom asked. Yeah, Allie said quickly. "Sure." He nodded. "Okay, just checking." "I do want to talk about it," she continued. "I really think we need to talk about it. This whole thing, it's pretty fucked up, But—" She let herself trail off. "But?" Tom prompted. She ran her fingers through her hair, mussing it more out of frustration than a need to fluff it up, then let her hands flop back on the bed. "But I mean, what's there really to talk about, We weren't shit-faced when we got married. We both knew what we were doing." She looked right at him pleadingly for assurance. "Right?" "Well, one of us did," he said with a wry smile. She sneered. "I don't deserve that." She pointed at him. "You could have called it off any time. You're a big boy, Tom. Nobody was forcing you to get married. Not at the courthouse, and not at the chapel. If you didn't want to go through with it, you should have just opened your fucking mouth and said so. Don't try making it my responsibility alone, goddammit." Tom groaned and let his chin drop onto his chest, then looked up. "It was a joke, Allie." He smiled to show there was no harm. "Just kidding, right?" She folded her arms across her chest and pushed out her lower lip in a deep pout. "Yeah, well, I don't think it was funny," she mumbled. Inwardly she grimaced, annoyed at the sulky tone of her voice. But she couldn't help it. She'd been hurt by the comment and wanted him to know it. She never had been very good at hiding her emotions. Tom stood up and crossed the room, to sit beside her on the bed. He took her right hand in his left and gently rubbed his thumb across the tops of her fingers. With his right he reached out to stroke her cheek. "You're right. You didn't deserve that," he said. "I'm sorry." He flashed a smile. "Okay, that was strike two. Still got one strike left, don't I?" He playfully tugged at her chin. "Maybe," Allie smiled. "Your batting average sucks, though." "So maybe I'm just in a slump. But I can still knock that hanging curve out of the park. My bat and me, we can work some miracles when the game's on the line." Tom winked, and Allie could only smile. "You know what they always say." She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I know. All the girls love the sweet stroke." Tom grinned. "That's why I'm so—" "Egotistical?" she interjected. He started, eyes wide with surprise, then chuckled. "I was gonna say popular." "One guy's popularity is another girl's egomania," Allie said. "Is that so?" He leaned in close, the tip of his nose brushing against hers. "You think I'm egotistical?" he asked, his voice a slow, seductive murmur. "Only as much as every other guy on the planet," she said in the same soft manner, then grinned devilishly. "That's why you're so easy for women to control." And with that she rolled out and away from him, to the other side of the bed. She put her feet on the floor, then looked over her shoulder at Tom. The disappointed expression carved into his features was priceless. "Hey, stud," she said, "in case you forgot, we came to Vegas to gamble, not spend every waking moment screwing." "Ugh," he shuddered melodramatically. "You make it sound so dirty when you talk about love that way with that potty mouth." She bent down to slip on her sneakers. "Honey, love ain't nothing but sex misspelled," she quipped and began tying the laces. "Where'd you pick that up from?" Tom asked. She shrugged. "Don't remember. Must have read it in a book somewhere. I was thinking about turning it into a t-shirt. Maybe have it printed down in the hotel gift shop." "Well, you certainly got enough landscape on that chest of yours to hang a billboard that long," Tom commented. She sat up and turned to face him. The wide, sardonic grin she wore brought a smile to her own face. "Smart-ass," she said. "That's egotistical smart-ass to you," he corrected. "If you're going to label me, you might as well be consistent about it." "I'll make a note of that," Allie replied, "in case I need to add more adjectives to the list later on." "Whatever," he said pleasantly. He jammed his hands into the pockets of his khaki knee-length walk shorts. "So to repeat the question, what do you want to do now?" He nodded his head in the direction of the small breakfast table. "Hotel brochure says they've got an observation deck and some fish restaurant up on the roof. You want to check that out?" Allie stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles in her t-shirt, tucking the bright pink garment back under the waistband of her white shorts. "Maybe later. We just ate a little while ago, remember?" "Okay, well, what do other people do on their—" Tom's voice trailed off, and Allie glanced up. He'd been about to say honeymoon. The flush of embarrassment on his face was evidence of that. He shrugged. "Well, you know." "Yeah?" she said quietly. She matched his shrug. "My parents went to Niagara Falls for their, you know. But you never really want to hear what they did you? Just the idea of your folks getting—" "Jiggy with it?" Tom offered. Allie stared at him for a moment, then frowned. "You are like the most tragically white guy on the planet, you know that? And about 5 years out of touch in trying to sound hip." Tom smiled and nodded toward the bed. "Yeah, well, it's not like we talk a lot about pop culture when we're doing the wild thing in the sack." "The wild thing?" Allie's frown deepened. "Could you stop talking like that, like, immediately? You're starting to sound like my mom when she used to tell me what she was like when she was a teenager. Jesus." Tom's eyebrows shot up. "Your mom used to tear it up back in her day?" Yeah, Allie thought, that would sure be a surprise to him, given how straight-laced and middle-American housewifey Jacqueline Dubé Goodwin appeared. The years might have added pounds to her body and lines to her face, and her hair might be more gray now than brown, but Jackie was still attractive in her own way. Certainly still attractive to her husband, who had been fairly handsome in his day. And it was easy to see, when mother and daughter were together, from whom Allie had inherited her good looks. Inheriting her mom's skills as a home economist, however, was another matter. Jackie was the type who kept an immaculate home, balanced the checkbook, still cooked dinner every night, participated in community bake sales, even gave piano lessons in the basement rec room 3 times a week. A regular June Cleaver, her mother, except apparently when the bedroom door was closed. Allie grimaced. Now there was an image she didn't need spinning around in her head. She looked at Tom, who was grinning like an idiot. "So now I know where you get that crazy nature from," he said. He exhaled dramatically. "That's a relief. I think I would have had a stroke if you told me you got your freakometer from your dad." "Hey," Allie said sharply. "It's not like I wanted to hear about her sexual adventures. It's just that back when I was having those—" She paused before continuing. She didn't like dredging up certain painful memories, especially these particular ones. "Problems, she used to sit down with me and tell me stories about her college days, trying to bond with me, I guess, to let me know I wasn't a complete alien to my parents, that she could kind of emphasize with what I was going through." Tom nodded in understanding. "I can see that. Makes sense, considering what you were going through back then." He slyly looked at her. "So, just how wild did your mom get?" "None of your fucking business," Allie countered. "You perv," with a smile, she said. He held up his hands in surrender. Okay, but you know I had to ask." She stared at him, one eyebrow raised to make it clear she thought he was full of shit. "Okay," he finally conceded. "I didn't have to ask. I was just curious is all." She crossed her arms across her chest. "Why?" she asked in mock seriousness. "Thinking about hitting on my mom when we get back?" Ew," Tom replied. "Thanks for the mental wallpaper, Allie." He shuddered like a drama queen, as though creeped out by her question. "No, I just wanted to know if your mom came anywhere close to what you—" "Not even," Allie replied. "Nobody I know comes anywhere close to what I used to do." She paused. "Not that, looking back, it's something to really be proud of." Tom nodded. "Yeah, I guess so." The nod continued as he drifted into silence. Now it was his turn to hesitate. Finally, he looked at her. "So, when do you want to talk about—" "Maybe later," she said, turning away. To her, it sounded like "maybe later," as though she couldn't get the words out fast enough to move the conversation along. Anything to keep their minds off of other matters. Okay," Tom said slowly. "But, I mean, you're the one who wanted to—" I know. Allie walked over to the dresser across from the bed to grab her fanny pack. "But not right now, okay? I just want to get out of the room for a while." She flashed a false smile at his reflection in the mirror. "After all, you don't travel almost halfway across the country and come to Vegas just to sit in your room all day, right?" He didn't respond, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking disappointed in her. Then he shrugged. "Well, we could hit the casino," he offered. Yeah, the casino sounds good," she replied, nodding like her head was attached to a spring. "I mean, trying my hand at poker was the whole point of coming here, not the other thing." "Still avoiding the issue, I see," said a tiny voice in the back of her mind. Christ almighty, she thought. What happened to all the talking we were supposed to be doing? I can't even get myself to say a couple of words like marriage or honeymoon. Her lips came together in a tight line. "Thought you gave up all that procrastinating shit after college, Allie." "All right," Tom said. "We better get going before the maid shows up to clean the room. Don't want to get in her way, right?" He grabbed his wallet, cell phone, and watch from the dresser. The wallet went into his back pocket, the watch onto his left wrist, and the phone into a plastic holster clipped to his belt. Allie noticed he was still wearing the wedding band, like he'd already gotten used to it. She looked at the matching ring on her own finger, and rubbed it between the thumb and forefinger of her right hand. It felt strangely heavy, and all too tight. "Like a noose around my neck," she thought glumly. Jackie Dubé might have been a bit rambunctious in her day, but in all honesty she couldn't hold a candle to her daughter. Not that there had ever been any sort of contest between them, until Allie's problems had become insurmountable. She hadn't even known about her mother's partying life at that point. That was probably a good thing, as Allie had often later reflected. Given her nature, she would have gone out of her way to top everything Jackie had done. Come to think of it, she had topped everything Jackie had done, and gone well past it. It wasn't anything she really liked to reminisce about. But there it was, a truly fucked up segment of her life that was lodged in the back of her thoughts like a sliver of wood stuck in her finger. Not too far from the surface, impossible to pull out, always causing her nagging pain. It lurked in her nightmares and haunted her daydreams, and although the shrinks she'd been to over the years assured her that the memories would fade in time and the emotional and psychological scars would heal, Allie knew better. The kind of shit she'd gone through, you never forget it. Not now, not ever. No matter how much time might pass. It started back in high school, as these things sometimes do. Once puberty took hold of her and transformed the chubby, pigtailed child into a curvy, dark-haired teenager, Bob and Jackie Goodwin realized they had missed their chance to lock up their only daughter in an ivory tower before the male population picked up the overpowering scent of her pheromones. It took Allie a little while to realize the attention she was getting from the male students wasn't the usual kidding around. She'd grown up with a lot of the guys, after all, and had always been considered more one of the gang than some stinky girl, probably because she played as rough as they did when it had come to the schoolyard. But once it became clear that some of them now wanted to be more than just friends, and that a few had actually grown into pretty hot-looking studs, a circuit apparently switched on in her head, and she put away her Ken dolls to start playing with boy toys of an entirely different sort. The hormonal floodgates had opened, and Allie allowed herself to be carried away with the flow. That turned out to be the biggest mistake of her young life. The last 2 years at Towers Peak High School became one long party, filled with weekends and summer vacations that were equally parts booze and drugs, reckless behavior, and unprotected premarital sex. All the things that would have guaranteed her suffering an extremely messy death in any low-budget horror movie involving a psychopath and a large kitchen knife. She found that sort of amusing. Then she developed an attitude. She became argumentative, stayed out till all hours of the night, and refused to tell anyone where she'd been or with whom. Had a number of encounters with the police, usually involving public drinking. Her parents tried to warn her about the dangers she was facing. Her teachers and school counselors tried to get through to her. Even her best friend, Talia Kraft, told her to slow down before something bad happened. Allie, however, was having too good of a time enjoying her newfound popularity to realize just how fucked up she was making her life. And so it continued as she graduated high school and moved on to college. Although how she'd managed to get that far without some tragedy befalling her was anyone's guess. Surprisingly, much to the Goodwins' confused delight, her grades had never fallen. Allie might have been the ultimate party girl, but she had no intention of going through life a drunken idiot, which made more than a few folks wonder if her wild behavior was just an act. It wasn't, though, and while the events of that night didn't quite make for a wake-up call, they certainly got her attention. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 4 and 5 of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand. And once again, we got a lot of character development and backstory tonight. We got to meet Warren, the fiancé/detective, homicide detective, and his partner. I've got to be honest with you, it was pretty hard reading that first chapter. You know, the death scene of a 10-year-old. That's one reason I'm not a homicide detective or an EMT. I just don't think I could handle that sort of thing. But we got through it. We got to find out his character. And, yeah, he sounds like he doesn't believe that mom for a second. And I don't think I do either. I think that her boyfriend had something to do with that. Not sure if the story is going to let us know what happens with that case or not, but it did give us a bit of Warren's character. And we got to get to know Tom and Allie a little bit more tonight. What did you guys think of that? I have a feeling, since we're 100 pages into the book, that the premonition part is coming up pretty soon. So I'm looking forward to that. Let me know in the comments section what you guys think of the book so far. These characters are pretty fleshed out. If y'all remember, in Death of the Senses, the premonition stuff had already happened by this point, and we were just kind of thrust into it. This book is taking a little more time to set up all the different characters and what they're up to, and giving us a little bit of their history. So I want to know what you guys think of all this so far, and I'll be back very soon with more of Final Destination: Dead Man's Hand. Again, tonight's episode was brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page, Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, and Sean Campbell. And if anybody else wants to join up, be sure to click the link in the description below to join the Patreon page for as little as $5 a month. You'll become a sponsor of every upload, and there's a lot of other goodies and benefits that goes along with being a patron. Not to mention early access to content. Come check it out, guys. I think you'll have a lot of fun. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
I'll see you soon.